Hello and welcome. This is Lights Out, and away we go with the episode. With the Formula One podcast for fans and by fans. I'm Will, and as I look across the digital garage, as always, I'm joined by my co-host, or should I say my co-driver, Sam. Hello, Sam. How are you?
Hello, Will. Hello, listeners. I'm very well, thank you. How's your week going so far?
Yeah, it's good. We should say we're a bit of a change of routine for us, because we usually record this on a Monday evening, but we're having to record it in the middle of the week because we're both busy people, and it's one of those unfortunate ones where we can both not do our usual Monday evening slot. So we're here recording, and actually it's very topical that we're recording now, because we could have released an emergency podcast, but we're actually going to cover it sort of quickly now. So as you can see, we're going to cover the 2026 regulations today, but before we get to that, there is some breaking Formula One news that's rocked the world in the last 24 hours. Nyck de Fries has been sacked as a driver from AlphaTauri, and Mr. Daniel Ricciardo is back. And I did say in the last podcast it'd be great to have Daniel back, and come on, Daniel, get back. And, you know, Red Bull have listened to my words and moved to get Daniel back into the sport. What do you make of the sacking and the return of the Honey Badger? That is Daniel Ricciardo, by the way.
Yes. I'm equally sort of pleased and sad, and it kind of equal measure, really. It does suck for de Vries. I think he's had a very poor season, and we've talked about how poor it's been at times on a few episodes actually this season for us. So I can understand why they've done it to some extent, and it will be great to have Ricciardo back. I think as I think I mentioned this on a previous episode, I think he and Yuki will make quite a good team. Actually, I think they'll have quite a good time together. So there's that. But I do think it's a bit like, it just doesn't quite sit right that de Vries got 10 races, and some other pretty terrible drivers through the years have had much longer than that. I mean, we hand out the T-fees on a weekly basis, and he got several seasons in Formula One. Even Mazepin, who was truly terrible, Mazepin got a whole season. So it does seem a bit harsh. I think to some extent de Vries has just been a bit unfortunate in that Ricciardo's hung around the sport. I think if Ricciardo had left and gone and done something else and just said, "Nah, I'm done with Formula One, I'm going to do something else now," he'd probably stayed. They wouldn't have risked getting rid of him for a junior driver who's never driven in Formula One before. But when you've got Daniel Ricciardo available, and apparently he's been doing tests with the Red Bull and seemingly posting some pretty good times, you know you're under pressure, really. And so it's proven to be. What about you? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think it's a very brutal sacking, because he hasn't been great, but he's not been terrible and awful. And, you know, his best finish was only 12th, but I think the AlphaTauri only have like 2 or 3 points, so it's not like Yuki's been scoring lots of points. I thought it was. I didn't like it from a few weeks ago, where like it almost be every race weekend, Dr. Helmut Marko would come out and just basically publicly criticize Nyck de Vries, and that just seems like a really bad way to manage your drivers, because you're not going to get someone performing well if they're just being publicly trashed all the time. And it's another failure for the Red Bull driver management. You know, that they have. You know, they just really struggle to keep drivers happy, or, you know, get the best out of drivers. How many drivers have they sacked for poor performance? And I think that's a failing on Red Bull. That is. It's also quite alarming for them as well, because they don't have any young drivers ready to step up. There was talks of Liam Lawson, who I think is an F2 driver. I don't know too much about him. I think he's doing quite well, but like, you know, AlphaTauri is the Red Bull team for their young drivers, and they've replaced not a young driver, a 27-year-old, but still young to the sport, with a 34-year-old. So it kind of goes against the aim of the team. And I actually think that Nyck de Vries is part of a wider game of chess that within Red Bull. And this is what Will Buxton, the journalist, was talking about on Twitter yesterday. He was saying that, you know, he thinks that they're doing this now to put pressure on Checo to say, look, you know, you've got to buck your ideas up, because this guy is going to be coming into the sport, and if he does well, he'll be getting you a seat. So you've got to buck your ideas up. And, you know, I can see it so clearly that come Christmas, if Checo still is having a bad run of form, I can see them giving it Danny Ric for next season. I think, you know, Red Bull have shown they can rip up a contract quite quickly. Yeah. And I think they're giving him Checo time, which is fair, but I feel like this is definitely to put pressure on Checo. And when Danny Ric knew he was leaving McLaren, he made it very clear that he wasn't going to go to a back of the field team, and yet he signed for a back of the year team for the rest of the season. So part of my theory is that there is a deal, or they've said to him, look, if you do well here, you could really have a shot of being back as the number 2 in the main team. And I think that's probably what's got him back into the sport. But yeah, as you said, it sounds like he's in a really good place. He's driving really well. I think they fixed some of the issues that he was experiencing with his confidence and just some of the things he was doing in the car, I think, in this simulator. And then, yeah, they did a tyre test at Silverstone yesterday, and his quickest time would have been second in qualifying, which obviously, there's tyres and fuel and the conditions, but still, that's still pretty impressive. And apparently, they were only an hour into the tyre test with Daniel Ricciardo, and Christian Horner phoned Helmut Marko to inform him on how he's doing. And then I think an hour later, Marko phoned back to say he'd sacked de Vries.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty brutal. I mean, we can be a little bit anti Red Bull on the pod, I think, sometimes, but it's stuff like this, and it's not so much the decision itself; it's more like how it's handled. That's just it's a bit. I don't know. It's not very classy. I think. Like Helmut Marko was saying some stuff, wasn't he, about de Vries? Like, so he publicly said that Horner was against him.
Yeah,
coming into the sport or taking that seat out for Tauri, and Helmut Marko disagreed with him, and like saying things like that publicly about a driver who's got 2 more races to. Got 2 more races to basically save themselves isn't great. And yeah, it's all just been like really public and pretty unpleasant, I think. And I don't know. I don't think you see that with most other teams, to be honest, on the grid. So
no.
if there's a reason why sometimes we're a bit anti Red Bull, it's kind of stuff like that. It's just a bit not very nice, I think.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people across the sport, across even Red Bull fans I saw on something on Twitter yesterday, were saying they thought it was incredibly brutal, incredibly harsh. And he's the thing as well with Nyck de Fries he's Formula E world champion. I think he's a Formula 2 world champion as well. He's had a very successful career up until this point, and then just to be like, oh well, you only get 10 races, and if you can't do it in those 10 races, you got that's very brutal, especially for Formula 1 when the cars are so hard to drive and so different to anything else they've done before, and also with the limited number of because they can't do unlimited tests now, can they? So they have very limited time getting up to speed. And I think that's what James Vowles was saying about Logan Sargent. It's like, if he was a rookie 20 years ago, they'd have so much more opportunities to get him in the car more regularly, to build up his miles and build up his confidence in the hours in the car.
Yep.
Whereas, Nyck de Vries has probably had to learn pretty quickly over the 10 races he had. And he obviously had a couple with Williams, but it's a completely different team and car as well. But yeah, I mean, probably the biggest winners of all of this on Netflix, because they've got Daniel Ricciardo back in Drive to Survive.
Yeah.
So that will be a great episode, his return, and also I'm sure him and Yuki, like you say, will be a good team as well. Do you think Danny Ric will annihilate Yuki? Do you think he'll be a class above, or do you think it could be quite a good battle between them as teammates?
I actually have no idea. I don't really know where to index Yuki at all, to be honest. Like I was thinking about this earlier, actually, when in the context of de Vries going, and I was thinking to myself, has de Vries had a worse first 10 races than Yuki did when he first came to sport? I'm not sure he did. I'm not sure he has. Like Yuki wasn't brilliant.
No.
And he's been given the time and obviously developed into quite a good driver. And yeah, but on the Daniel Ricciardo kind of Yuki Tsunoda thing, I'm not really sure. Yeah, I don't really know where to index either of them, because Ricciardo was brilliant and then he had a terrible time at McLaren, like really, really bad. And basically, left the sport. It didn't seem like he was going to come back again. And Yuki, I think he's flattered to deceive at points. So yeah, I'm not really sure. It wouldn't surprise me if Ricciardo ends up like doing quite well. I think there's definitely something to be said for taking a break, coming back refreshed, sort of remotivated. And if he has been told about the prospect of taking the Red Bull seat next season, if he has a good sort of rest of this year, next 5 months, whatever it is, maybe that will sort of spur him on and serve as a good motivator for him. I mean, there's no getting around the fact he's driving a pretty slow car.
Yeah.
And the prospect of points finishes is going to be quite difficult. But, we've seen some pretty great things from him in the past. So, yeah, I hope he can rediscover the form he had 5 years ago. But in terms of how he compares to Yuki, I don't know. I mean, we'll find out very quickly, won't we? It's not too long till Hungary. So, look forward to it.
Yeah, I'm intrigued to see what he's like on track as well. I think for him, success probably looks like just getting points, a couple of points here and there quite often throughout the season, because like you say, that AlphaTauri is not a point scoring car at all, really. So if he can get lucky and be in the right place at the right time, and if he can get them 10 points or something, I think that'd be massive for them, because they'd soon climb up their constructors standings.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's Nyck de Vries and his brutal sacking and the return of the honey badger, Daniel Ricciardo. we'll see what happens over the next couple of days. And by the time we've been to Hungary as well, Danny Ric could come back in and win his first race back. Unlikely, but it could happen. But I'm sure we'll have more to talk about this as the season progresses. And it's just great to have Danny Ric back in the sport. I think such a brilliant character and a great driver as well. So today's episode, we're going to talk about the 2026 regulations. So that's the next big overhaul that the teams are going to have to experience and prepare for, and that the sport are introducing. We don't know what the chassis rules are going to be yet. They've not fully announced those yet, but the FIA have sort of hinted that they want shorter, slimmer, and lighter cars, which I think that's something you and I both really want, because we think these cars are far too heavy.
Yes.
But what we do know is that they've decided what the engine regulations are, and it's going to be a pretty big change, probably the biggest change we've had in engine regulations since the hybrid engines came in 2014. Was it 2016? 2014, yeah. So what I'll do is I'll quickly run through the changes that are coming in, and then Sam, I'll get your thoughts on what you think of the positives of these changes. So
Okay.
there's going to be a much greater focus on sustainable fuels, with there being no new fossil carbon being burned. And I did look through the Formula One sort of like 7 things you need to know about the regulations, and they really have not written it for the layman. It's quite a complex sort of explainer, but so basically what this will be is just trying to make sure the cars be as net zero as possible and using more sustainable fuels, so like sustainably produced fuels rather than just them being fully electric. Which brings me on to electric. The engines are now the hybrid part of it, the electric part of it, are now going to have 3 times the amount of electrical power. So that's going to make a massive difference, because it's no longer be fully, just internal combustion engine. It's going to be quite big on the electrical side of it as well. And I think it's going to be like a 50-50 split of electrical power and like internal combustion engine power as well. The cars will still be 1,000+ horsepower, which is good, but with less fuel use. So in 2013, 160 kilograms of fuel was used in a race. In 2020, that stood at 100 kilograms, and the aim for 2026 is to just use 70 kilograms. So obviously that shows you how much they're going to hope the cars can be powered by these electric motors that have got them as well. There's going to be engine specific cost cap coming in, and more standardized components as well. I think all the batteries have to be in a certain area of the car together, sort of grouping them together.
Yep.
These regulations are going to make it harder for the drivers when they're coming out of corner exits, I think. And they've also got to do some more recycling of their batteries. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, what it is trying to be more, eco efficient, and with that desire to be net zero for the sport to be net zero by 2030. They're obviously going in that direction, focusing a lot on the hybrid aspect of it and really going big on that, and just trying to be as sustainable as possible. I think that's all of the regulations. What your sort of reaction to them? What do you think? What you think is going to be positive about these? I'm sure there'll be some negatives, but we'll come to that later.
Yeah, let's save the negatives, shall we? Because it's probably fair to say they outnumber the positives to some extent. But there are some positives to this. So I'm on board with the sport being more green. I think the aim of being sort of carbon neutral by 2030 is a good one and seemingly pretty achievable. So that's good. I think the major things for me are, so I really, the cars have got to get smaller. So it sounds like that's what they're promising. I mean, we'll see it I'll believe it when I see it, basically. I think that they've got some opportunity. So the fact that the cars will require less fuel means they obviously need less space for fuel tanks. And they've also dropped the MGU-H, which is another key component with the energy within the energy recovery system. And all of the energy is going to be coming from the MGU-K, which is basically reharvesting kinetic energy instead of heat energy, which is what the H stands for in MGU-H. So there will be more space, definitely, in the car, or more space for them to kind of move bits of the bodywork and chassis into to try and make them smaller. So that's good. That should help racing. It's really good that there's some new players, I think, as well involved in the sport. I mean, they've been crying out for new manufacturers for absolutely ages. So to have Audi committed already, 2026. I mean, Ford are kind of involved, but it looks like they're not. They're doing a kind of similar thing to Porsche with what they did previously, and their involvement in the sport, in that they'll be sort of included in the delivery of the car, but their actual involvement in the development of the car is quite limited. And then there's this prospect, isn't there, of Cadillac entering the sport potentially as well. And the fact that Honda is sticking around is good because it looked like they were going to leave. Obviously, they're now sticking around and partnering with Aston Martin, which I think I'm going to call it early could be quite a potent combination. So the fact that they've got those extra manufacturers involved in the sport's really good. It helps with a bit more variety. That does come with a downside, which we'll cover in the second half. And then a few other bits and pieces. So the cars will be safer, I think it's fair to say. Even though they're getting smaller and stuff, I think they'll find like more sustainable and strong materials to make the cars out of. So that'll help with the protection of the drivers. And equally, I mean, you mentioned it. They're creating something called a safety cell, where basically all of the kind of high-powered electronics and stuff will be kept in one specific part of the car, which isn't the case at the moment. So things like the car catching fire at the weekend should hopefully become a bit rarer. And equally, at the moment, it's quite difficult when the cars have a fault and they break out on track and then they have to be picked up. Like there's a whole process to go through to try and power them down so that none of the marshals are injured, because there's so much electricity flowing through the cars at the moment. If they haven't got that sorted out, it's quite easy for people to get electrocuted and for it to be quite dangerous. So the fact that they're fixing that's quite positive as well. So again, that will have a net benefit on track. If we see cars breaking down, they should be able to be moved a bit quicker, which means we get more race time, which is good for the sport. And then a couple of other small things. So I thought the active aero thing was quite interesting. So they're looking to introduce active aero. Again, they haven't defined this yet, but what it basically means is they will have aerodynamics on the cars that are active when they're going slowly around corners to basically help increase level of downforce and help them corner, but then they will reduce in a similar way to what they do with DRS at the moment, but on a more active kind of permanent basis, to help them reduce drag when they're on the straights. And again, that's all with the aim of like saving fuel. But I think from a drivability perspective, that will help make the cars go a bit quicker. And again, that's kind of what we want. We want high speed as much as possible. And yeah, lighter. God, please let them be lighter. That's the next thing I think. Like if they can help make the cars lighter alongside making them smaller, that would be great. So I think that's those are the main sort of positives I took from the 2026 regulations. How about you? What did you pull out as your kind of positive aspects to it?
Yeah, I saw many of the same as you really. I do think the manufacturer is an interesting one, because it's obviously been designed to entice new manufacturers into the sport, and I think that will be quite interesting because you'll have, they'll have a real range of engines available for teams to use, and that hopefully they're all quite similar or they've all got the individual strengths, which then it makes it a bit more interesting. Whereas at the moment, I think it's mainly just Mercedes, Ferrari, and then Honda Red Bull engines basically, but even then that's only two teams. So yeah, I am quite excited to see Ford come into the sport and see how they get involved, and like you say, Audi create their own engine, and the idea of Cadillac as well was part of the if the American team is successful, that'd be really cool. And it's definitely clear that they've learned from the last engine regulation change, because when the last ones came in 2014, Honda entered the sport a year later, and they really struggled. Their engines were sort of a laughing stock, weren't they? They were unreliable. They weren't very quick, and even led to Fernando Alonso calling it a GP2, basically a Formula 2 engine. So I think they're really conscious that they don't want a repeat of that in the future with newer manufacturers, because say if Audi came in and then they had that same thing happen to them, I think they'd be pretty pissed, and it wouldn't look great for the sport. It makes it look quite exclusive. I still, like you say, I really like the sort of focus on being green and the net zero focus. I think it's really good that the sport is being quite proactive about that. And it probably has to be proactive on it to face criticism from other people outside the sport, saying that how can we be net zero, or how can everyone else be pushing to save the climate when you've got a sport that is not very conscious. And they're doing loads of stuff even at the moment, with the way they transport all their stuff around the world to races, and what the emissions they emit at a track as well with the cars, but also with the sort of the whole traveling circus as well. But I think probably one of the biggest benefits of it will be that there's a real big opportunity for things to shake up, because there's such big changes across a range of areas that we could have a real, the grid could get really mumbled around and jumbled around. And we saw that, with the dominance of Mercedes. They kind of came out of nowhere, really. They had the strongest engine for about 4 years, and they were untouchable. And that was obviously great from one perspective, but also not great from a domination sort of perspective. But I think it should make it really interesting, and we should have a really good sort of development race, because they'll all be learning a lot about these engines as they develop them and sort of test them more. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how the how they line up when they get to that first race, and the difference in engines and performance as well.
Yeah, definitely. I hope as well. I do hope there is a bit of a shake up, but I hope it's competitive. I do worry because every time there's a significant regulation change, generally speaking, one team absolutely nails it. So you've mentioned Mercedes and most recently Red Bull.
Yeah.
I think as we've seen since the regulation changes that came in for 2022, it's basically taken teams 18 months to get to a point where they're like starting to copy Red Bull because they know it's the best philosophy, and it'll probably be another 6 months before we see teams actually on a par with them. So that's why we've got so much hope on next season, because hopefully by that point the teams will have learned enough to properly compete with them. And yeah, if 2026 goes in a similar direction, we could be looking at waiting for a good couple of years and sort of approaching the 2030s before we get competitive seasons again, and then the FIA will be talking about changing more regulations. So yeah, I just hope it kind of works out in such a way that it's at least vaguely competitive, and we don't see what we've seen for a little while now, where anytime anything changes, that a team dominates for a period and everybody else plays catch up, and then just as they catch up and it starts getting interesting, the regulations change again, and then we repeat the cycle. So hopefully that doesn't happen.
It'll be interesting to see where, just on that, it'll be interesting to see where the sport goes, because I know we're talking about 2026 now, but like where the sport goes to future regulations, because they're obviously still very mindful of that, like what Formula One develops, and sort of the technology in Formula One still has to be applicable and can apply to car manufacturing. And if it's probably likely that petrol and diesel cars over time are going to disappear and we're going to be fully electric. Does that mean Formula One is going to end up being fully electric? And I've not really seen a conversation or a debate or that being suggested, but that would be quite different if the sport kind of got rid of all the sort of engine part of it. It was all just batteries, but it also becomes a bit like Formula E. But yeah, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what the long term vision is to where Formula One goes as a sport. If the world is moving to more electric vehicles, surely Formula One has to follow. But does that mean it will then, the bit of the engine, the petrol bit, will just disappear over time?
Possibly, yeah. It's hard to know, isn't it? I mean, I would say there are still an awful lot of people involved in Formula One. Thinking particularly about most of the drivers that I think place quite a lot of value on having internal combustion involved within the power units as they are at the moment. I mean, you and I have talked. We'll probably talk about this in the second half of the podcast, but we talked previously about like if they're going to have fully sustainable fuels, what's stopping them from using V8s or V10s and getting rid of the hybrid part altogether and leaving the electrics up to Formula E. But that wouldn't necessarily help bring other manufacturers in the sport. There is definitely a benefit for them in terms of developing their own hybrid cars for the public masses. And yeah, that benefit is generally driving kind of engagement, and why people like Audi have come in and bought a team and stuff. So it's quite hard to go back on that now. But yeah, it will be really interesting. The balance between kind of combustion and electric over the next sort of 10 years in the sport is going to be really interesting to see how that pans out. I really hope personally they don't lose combustion. I think that is a key component of the sport. I think the sound of the cars is an important thing. I mean, I know like for some people it's not, but I think for the majority of people that watch Formula One, the way the cars sound is quite important. And yeah, you basically remove all sound if you if you make them fully electric, as we've seen in Formula E. They make a bit of a whine, but that's about it. So yeah, it will be really interesting. I think they're like Stefano Domenicali's at a bit of an interesting crossroads, I think, because by the time these 2026 regulations come to an end, sort of towards 2030, they'll need to have a clear idea of where the sport's going, I think, because organizations like Mercedes and like Red Bull and Ford and Audi and Renault and all these other companies, they're going to want clarity. And certainly as they're going to have budget caps in place, it's still pretty expensive to run Formula One teams and develop all this stuff over the long term. So they will want some level of clarity, I think. And yeah, as you sort of mentioned there, we don't really have it at the moment.
Yeah, just before we go to a break, I think Ferrari will be the ones to watch, because they don't have they've shown no interest in Formula E. They don't have an electric car. And if the sport goes to electric and away from combustion, I can see them threatening to walk away from the sport, which is they've done it in the past. They've threatened to walk away from the sport, but as the longest running team, that is a massive threat if they no longer see a future in Formula One. And I think that will be they could come to that junction where you kind of get the manufacturers that do have electric cars wanting to go even more electric, and then you got those that don't want to go in that direction, which include Ferrari wanting to go another direction. And I mean, this must be 10 years ago now, 15 years ago, when they had to sign the Concord Agreement and they couldn't agree, Formula One and the teams couldn't agree on this agreement. and it got to the point where Ferrari were regularly threatening to walk away and create a new racing series. And we, not looking at my crystal ball too much, but that could happen.
Yep.
But we'll see. I think that wraps up the positives. Obviously, there's some quite good positives there. But I think there's probably more to get our teeth stuck into in the negatives. And so we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back. Hello, welcome back from the break. Hope you had a jolly old time. We had a very, I was going to say we had a very jolly time, but we didn't, because I said to Sam, imagine what happens if Red Bull win every race for the next 3 years until the new regulations come in. But that's probably unlikely. But anyway, so we talked about the positives. We outlined the changes. What do you see as the negatives of these new regulations, Sam?
So I'll start with some of the mechanical bits. So because of the engine changes they're making, it seems quite likely that turbo lag's going to return. And if you're not aware of what that is, listener, it's basically where there's a turbo in the engine that takes time sometimes to spool up, whereas the way the engines are designed at the moment, the MGU-H does a lot of the hard work there in terms of keeping the turbo running, and it means that you don't really get that lag when you exit a corner and put your foot down on the accelerator hard. It's quite likely that's going to come back in from 2026 onwards, and also it means the cars are going to be quite difficult out the exit of corners. So you mentioned that in the first half. That does have quite big implications for drivers, because at the moment, basically the best way to overtake is to get a good exit from a corner, and if you're constantly not getting a good exit from a corner, say onto a straight, it makes overtaking much more difficult. So that is definitely a concern I have. And you throw in the kind of prospect of the cars being quite heavy still. They are really, really heavy now. I'm hoping the weight drops for 2026. They haven't really sort of outlined whether or not that's like how they're going to do that through those regulations. I feel like they're going to have to do that soon, though, so teams can start thinking about it. But yeah, that's definitely a concern. I think the fact that the cars will be harder to drive, they'll be slower out of like through the exits of corners, and that will make overtaking more difficult than it is at the moment. Yeah, the dominance of one team feels, I don't want to say likely, but quite a possible outcome, I think. It does tend to happen every time regulations change significantly. We've seen it the last like 3 or 4 times it's happened. So yeah, it feels like a real possibility. And I guess our hope in that situation is that whatever team's dominating has 2 very competitive drivers driving for it. So we get to see something of a battle rather than what we've got at the moment, which is just a total procession. And also there's something about, and I think this is sort of negated by the prospect of active aero if they bring it in and when they make those regulations clear. But when the regulations changed in 2014, there was definitely a kind of a feeling in the paddock that like engine performance was the primary factor behind the car's success, alongside obviously the quality of the drivers they had. Now, Mercedes dominated that period, and I think everybody has generally agreed that like a large part of that dominance, alongside Lewis Hamilton obviously, was their engine. They had nailed those regulations from the beginning. Their engine was by far the best. The drivers constantly went on about it. I remember Alonso sat next to Lewis Hamilton in one press conference, and he was asked something to the effect of, "Oh, what one thing could you change about Formula One?" And he said, "Equal engines for everybody." And Lewis said, "I don't agree with that one," because obviously he was winning at the time. And I remember Adrian Newey basically took a step back from Formula One for a couple of years during that period, because his quote was, "Well, it's just become an engine formula now. Why would I bother? Like, I'm an aerodynamicist by trade. Like, I don't really care if one engine's more powerful than the other. There should be more to it than that." And he was probably right to some extent. And he's sort of voiced concerns about these new regulations as well. He said that he feels like the cars are going to be significantly slower than they are at the moment, and there is a risk that we return to this kind of phase where if one team absolutely nails it from an engine development perspective, or a manufacturer nails it, that's going to be the determining factor of whether or not a team wins. And that's a pretty, I don't know, again, not necessarily likely, but I think it's a fairly reasonable concern to have. And I suppose the last thing is, I guess it's not so much what's wrong with the regulations, it's what could be right if they did them slightly differently. I think you and I have talked before about the fact that they're bringing in 100% sustainable fuels, and if they're doing that, do they really need a hybrid aspect to all of this? The hybrid system takes up a huge amount of space in a car as it is at the moment. It's also very heavy. You could just replace all of them with a slightly bigger fuel tank and just fill the cars up with ethanol and run a proper V10 or a V8. That's the dream. It won't happen, but again, that's just, it felt like that was a potential opportunity, and that would be a very good way for the sport to kind of separate itself out from the kind of hybrid electric development type race that we're seeing at the moment, and leave that to Formula E, and that would in turn have a good effect probably on Formula E and make that slightly more desirable for some manufacturers to be involved in too. So yeah, those are the kind of major things that sort of come immediately to mind. Oh, and also obviously the drivers aren't seemingly that positive about it either. I think they're probably quite a good barometer. They just want good wheel-to-wheel racing as well, and generally the only person that likes it when there's a really dominant car up front is the person driving the dominant car. Everybody else is just a bit bored and wants to race properly. So yeah, that's definitely a concern. But yeah, what about you? What jumped out at you?
Yeah, well, just on the sustainable fuels and the V10, Sebastian Vettel has got a really impressive collection of Formula One cars from a range of different areas, and he's doing quite a lot at the moment where he's sort of doing show runs in them with sustainable fuels, and I think that hopefully is kind of like showing them that it is easy to do, and it you can still have great cars. So hopefully you can carry on with that work and like raising the profile of that as an option, because you can almost see what can happen is they could introduce these new engines that have gone too far down the hybrid road, if you pardon the pun, and then they go, actually, well, we should revert back, and look, Sebastian Vettel has been showing us for years that we can do it well with ethanol, and we can have really good engines and still be a motorsport that is good like that. In that area, so I think that should never be discounted as an option if things don't go to plan. And I think you're right. I think the diehard Formula One fans are desperate for Formula One to go in that direction, but it's just not going to happen. That ship seems to have sailed for the time being. On the weight, I actually read in an article that they could get about 30 kilograms heavier because of all the new sort of the bigger batteries and the bigger stuff they've got to have for the electrical side, because they weigh so much, but also some of the safety stuff as well. That weighs quite a bit as well. And just to give you a bit of like context, so in 2008, the cars weighed about 585 kg. That went up to 691 kg when the hybrid engines were introduced in 2014. So over 100 kg in that. And now these 2022 cars have to be a minimum of 798 kilograms. And then when you put the drivers and like with a bit of fuel in, and you get them weighing in at 900 kg, which is extraordinary from where it was even just 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So they really have to find ways to reduce the other bits of the size and the weight of the car, so that if they have to be 30 kg heavier from all this new stuff, net overall they actually are getting lighter. So yeah, I think that's a real priority. I think for Formula One to not mess around with the weight of the cars and make them heavier, because I think that will annoy the fans, and I think it will annoy the drivers as well. And yeah, I think there is a real risk there being a sort of engine formula dominant Formula One team, and that makes the sport less competitive. And can the sport really afford another period so soon after this year where one team just storms it for several years? Like, I think the sport's, if it wants to keep growing and retain the people the new fans it's got to make it regularly, season on season, entertaining spectacle. Whereas if it becomes a bit of a procession every year, it would just become like the Bundesliga, and that's not a great league at all. So yeah, I don't know. I think it could go one of two ways really. It could be either really good and it's great to see the sport pioneer and focus on that hybrid area, or it could be everyone's really unhappy. It creates a really bad product of the sport, and then becomes too long. It will then take a couple of years for them to correct it, won't it?
Yeah, it will. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. We'll be really interested to see what they do. I think it feels like the next 18 months are really important for the sport. I think like they're going to have to release like further regulation updates on the chassis and other components and things for the cars for 2026. So I think we can probably make a fuller assessment sort of once all of that stuff comes out. But Yeah, the engine changes are really significant, and yeah, there's definitely an inherent danger that one team gets it really right. And it's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? Really, because you think they're trying to make the sport more sustainable and move to this kind of hybrid model, but like the way they've done it and removing the MGUH, it's really put a lot more strain actually on the internal combustion aspect of the engine as it is already, because that will now also be critical in charging the battery up. Um, and that means that like inadvertently you've made it kind of a really important kind of aspect of development of it. Like you get the batteries and the motors and stuff right, absolutely fine, but like because it's 50% going to be 50% electrical, like suddenly you've got a huge strain of pressure on the engine to try and help recharge the batteries as well as move the car forward. So yeah, there's definitely a risk there that kind of inadvertently they they make the kind of internal combustion element suddenly even more important than it is at the moment, which was sort of the point. It's sort of not the point. They were trying to do the opposite through these regulations. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting. I think like keeping an eye on the noises coming out of some of the bigger teams, I think will be really interesting. And like Ferrari, as you've sort of mentioned already, are a really big player in all of this. They are the kind of heart and soul of Formula One to some extent. So yeah, fascinating. But I'm kind of looking forward to it. I really do want like the kind of the wider regulations before making a proper assessment of whether or not we think this is going to work. And obviously the proof will very much be in the pudding in 2026 when we see them on the road for the first time. But if they can find a way to make the cars more competitive, more raceable, lighter and smaller, I feel like that's a move in the right direction from a raceability perspective. Never mind all the green stuff, which we're all very pro anyway. They've got to get the kind of raceability of the cars bit right too. I feel like that's a key part.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just on the sort of team and driver reaction, we're kind of starting to see it become a bit of a debate within the sport. And there's one team kind of leading that debate at the moment, and that's Red Bull. Christian Horner came out at the British Grand Prix very sort of anti them. He thinks the 50-50 split between electrical and internal is too much. And I think they're concerned that the battery is going to take so long to charge over a lap. You're going to have to see drivers sort of adapt, not going flat out, so they can charge the battery up for the whole lap. And he called these new engines technical Frankensteins. And I think it's not great if you have a car that you can't consistently deploy the electric part of it because they have to spend so much of the lap time trying to recharge it. And you're seeing Max as well coming out and sort of being quite critical of them as well. He said he's seen data and they've been on the simulator as well, and he's very concerned about recharging. He's saying, like Monza, for example, they'll be going down the main straight and they'll have to shift down a gear just so they can recharge, which is, that should not be happening. If the sport walks into that, that's a real error for drivers to be doing that. And similar to you, it's almost like you and Max share the same view. He thinks it's going to be basically a battle about the internal combustion engine part, and that will be the development war, and that'll be the main thing that dominates these new engines, which, like you say, is kind of the opposite direction. What Red Bull seems to be pushing for is to move the split away from 50-50 between electric and combustion. I don't think it wants to be much. I think they're thinking more 60-40. And Ferrari, Fred Vasseur has come out and said they might be supportive of it. But as Christian Horner is really trying to make a real sort of, we try to say we've not got long to go here. We need to sort this and have a debate about this quickly as possible. And then, in true sort of Formula One politics style, Toto Wolff comes out and he's like, I completely disagree. The rules aren't changing at all. These new regulations are really important to bring in these new manufacturers. And Christian Horner is only saying this because they obviously must be nervous or not happy with how the development of their new engine is. So they're trying to change the rules to sort of stop them being at the back of the grid. I mean, that's just been playing mind games and trying to wind up Christian Horner, but would be quite interesting because it's no coincidence that your star driver and your team principal have come out saying very similar lines about these new engines. I looked online, I didn't see many other comments from any other people, but I wonder if we're going to start seeing a bit more, because probably a lot of people aren't really focusing on 2026 yet, whereas probably Red Bull can afford to look that far ahead.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily just discount everything team principals say, but I would to some extent, because I feel like the interests of team principals and drivers aren't often the same. Like, I know Max loves winning, and at the moment he's doing a lot of it, but I and we talked a bit about this in episodes recently where he's been winning races by so much he just sounds bored and he's trying to find ways to keep himself interested, kind of thing. Like he's a pure racer kind of person in the same way that Lewis is. I think, like, if you ask both of them what they would rather have, like a really, really dominant car that's going to just constantly win and they might have a chance of being in that car, or much more competitive cars across the board that allow more teams to compete, they'll both probably pick the latter, I would have thought. Now, team principals will never do that. They have self-interest. You know, they just want to win. So I think, yeah, to some extent, I'll be looking more at the kind of drivers' reactions, I think, over the next 18 months about to make my assessment of whether or not the regulations look like they're moving in the right direction, because they're the ones who have to drive the cars. They're the ones who want to race. They're the ones who want it to be competitive and to have fun while they're doing their job. So, yeah, I'll sort of trust their judgment a bit more than Christian Horner and Toto Wolff playing the politics of what can I do to most benefit my organisation.
Yeah. I think it's going to become a bigger debate over the rest of this season. I think we're just seeing it being kicked off and put up higher up the agenda by Red Bull, and I think you're going to see a bit more debate from different teams coming in, and also just, you know, it getting more coverage and people talking about it as well. And as the teams are working on it as well, I'm sure they'll be able to start coming out more publicly and saying, well, you know, actually from our simulation we think X or Y, and also there's probably so much lobbying that's going on behind the scenes to the FIA and to Formula One to sort of each team, you know, privately. They may not be saying it publicly, but I'm sure they're all thinking about it and getting on with it and trying to sort of represent their interests right at this very moment.
Yeah, absolutely. What did you make of it's something we haven't really talked about actually in this episode. It's about like they're thinking about bringing active safety measures, aren't they? Where, like, so at the moment, like if you drive a specific type of car, probably an expensive one, and like you drift across the white line or whatever, the car will like wake, you know, like it will detect whether or not you've like fallen asleep or something, and it will automatically correct the car and stuff. And like you just have like all these automated systems from a safety perspective. And Formula One are talking about bringing something similar in to the sport. So like the system itself would detect whether there's been an incident and slow cars down and stuff automatically. What did you make of that as a suggestion?
So yeah, we've not actually talked about that. I did see that mentioned in one article. I don't know, because you know, I think usually when there's an incident, Formula One drivers are very good at adapting to, like, you know, because their reaction speeds, but also like they're so alert to what's going on, and also the marshalling is so good that they kind of get informed by the marshals, but also by their teams exactly what's going on. And it's very rare that you see an incident and then right directly behind it another incident because they've failed to react to that. And I don't know, maybe just think about it like, will they struggle if they go to react to something and then the car's already doing it for them? Will that then be more of an issue? Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of not really been talked about much. There's not much on it, but yeah, I'm a bit intrigued by it. What are your sort of initial thoughts on it?
My first thought was, if they're going to do it, it will have to be tested to the absolute limit, probably through other formulas first. I don't think you could introduce it like quickly into Formula One, because, as you say, it will have implications for drivers and stuff, and like the mechanics of how a race is organised and run. That will need serious testing, I think, either through Formula 3 or Formula 2, probably. So, yeah. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'm necessarily opposed to it as a concept. I mean, I don't know. It feels like I say that it feels like a long time. Japan last year was probably the last time we saw some like real safety issues during Formula One race, and I suppose the pit lane thing. But you can't do anything about that. Like, no automated system is going to stop people wandering through a pit lane when they shouldn't do. So,
no.
Yeah, I'm sure there are certain things they can do, but yeah, I do have my concerns about kind of on an automated basis taking some of the control away from drivers in that moment, because they are recruited as the 20-ish best drivers in the world with the best reactions. So, what's the point in having those skills if you're going to sort of dampen them in the situation where you probably want them using them to avoid issues? But yeah, I just thought it was an interesting suggestion. Of all of them, it's kind of the one that's talked about the least, but it could have the most most impact on sort of how races are run and stuff. So
yeah, definitely. Well, I think one to watch that one.
Absolutely. So I think that brings us to the end of the podcast. Thanks very much for joining us. I hope you look forward to 2026 as well. Remember to subscribe and leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. If you enjoyed it, why don't you share the podcast with a friend? Hopefully they enjoy it more than Nyck de Fries, Rutroll, has enjoyed this past week. We are on Twitter at Lights Out Lads, and on Instagram we are at the Lights Out Pod. Will, I'll see you. Well, I won't see you in Hungary, but I'll see you for Hungary very soon.
Yes, yeah. We'll off to Budapest, and we'll be joined by Mr. Daniel Ricciardo as well. I think that will probably be the story of the weekend, because unless someone manages to win the race, it's not a Red Bull and not much has happened. I think most people are going to be watching what he's up to very closely and how he does. So yeah, we'll be bringing all our analysis and all our hot takes from the Budapest Grand Prix next week. Thanks very much for listening. All the best and goodbye.
Bye bye.